Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Van Helsing. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, it's the interesting thing where Michaela's like, oh, I've risen you, and now... Well, for one, it seems like Michaela doesn't just go back a century. She says, I've been gathering the sisterhood for centuries. So she's been doing this for a while. I guess that monastery 100 years ago might have been the most... I don't know. It's unclear, like, how old she actually is, how long she's been what she is. But she, once again, that's what I thought was interesting. I'm like, oh, so you're going to raise the Dark One to be yours to control? And it's like, oh, and even the Dark One be like, oh, you got this twisted. Do you think you know who I am? It's like, I've been around since, like, a long time. Like, I've kind of coincided with humanity, because it is kind of what I was kind of wondering last episode. The Dark One did have a body once upon a time, but it ended up being destroyed, and now the Dark One has basically been roaming around, trapped in this world without a physical form until now. This is the first time the Dark One's had a physical form in forever. So that's interesting, and because we do know eventually, at some point later on down the road, Abraham eventually imprisons himself and the Dark One. So that's eventually how that happens. But now Michaela's kind of, it's like, oh, I'll serve you. Because basically, she's like, I became aware of your existence, and I've kind of gathered everything to give you a physical form in this world. But it's like, so you'll serve me now. It's like, no, the other way around. The Dark One's like, you're going to serve me. And so basically, also, once again, it showcases that it's something I never really took notice of, but the Dark One is, it seems like, because I was wondering, it's like, you're not actually a vampire. You're on a completely different level. You kind of follow different rules. For one, she's not affected by the light, because I guess, because what the Dark One is at its true essence is pure darkness, and no amount of sunlight can counter it. It's like, it's almost like vampires are like weak, very much weaker offsets. Like whatever, I guess, like, what was kind of left of the Dark One that kind of eventually like spawned vampires, because she is kind of like their mother while also not being, so I guess whatever, like losing her physical form, just being, I guess, the embodiment of darkness, just makes it so that she's not affected by light like her somewhat children are. I guess they're not really her. There's still still clear connection that they're like a direct connection of like, right, they were born from her, and if they were, like, and how did that come to be? Once again, there's a lot of stuff that like I'm overthinking that I don't think they're really, I mean, maybe they are explaining it and I'm just being an idiot about it and just kind of picking up on the context of everything, but it's just interesting because it's like, right, I mean, because to be fair, when we meet up with the Dark One, like, the world, the Rising has already happened, and obviously the Rising is rescinding a little bit, but it's at such a slow rate. Like, obviously vampires are still able to run rampant and control the world. But now we see, like, oh, like, light doesn't affect her to the point she could literally use her own power. That also showcases, too, like, she's not a regular vampire, because, I mean, to be fair, her, Michaela, and, as well as, Bathory are on a completely different level because they can use magic, and it's like she's top dog when it comes to magic, because even Willem ends up being able to use magic, but that's just because I guess he was around long enough for centuries to be able to learn it. So it kind of showcases, like, once again, how much of a special case they all are. But she encapsulates the whole entire place in darkness. Obviously, they're trying to use the mark on Jack's arm to, like, track them. So, Bathory ends up cutting it off. I was thinking, like, are we going to lop her arm off or something? It's like, oh boy. But it's like, oh, they just cut it out. But it's so ingrained in her that literally there's, like, tendrils from, like, it being connected to her, like, as they're pulling it up. Because it looks like it's basically seeped into her, like, veins and stuff like that. So as they're pulling it up, you see these little tendrils as they kind of cut it away. And she's like, Bathory's like, you're strong, Jack. You're so strong. And she's like, yeah, right. That hurt like a son of a bitch. It's like, all right, let's get this done. But obviously with her as powerful as they are, they won't be able to challenge her the way they are. So they go back to the village and like track down Florian as well as some of the others. A lot of them end up getting wiped out by the Sisterhood, but luckily Florian and Alexandra are still okay. So now it's like depicting like, okay, so what are we going to do? And Bathory, like, the only choice they'll have is to use the scroll, but there's a drawback to it, because if Bathory does it, it opens her up to the darkness, And that kind of makes you go like, okay, so potentially this is how it's happened. Because at first I'm still like, a lot has changed, and I'm like, okay, so maybe things aren't going to be 100%. Like, it seemed like things are going to be like vastly different, and I was curious how that was going to play out. Granted, we get our resolution of that at the end of the episode, but I'll get to that soon enough. But I think it's so fascinating. It's like, right, she's gonna have to open herself up to the darkness, and so she wants Jack to promise, like, if I get too close to the darkness, you're gonna have to kill me. Because it's still like, oh, like, Bathory's like, I still don't want to know my fate, because, like, for her, my fate isn't 100% sealed in stone. I can change it, especially if you don't know it. It kind of still leaves. But sadly, it seems like even if not knowing your fate doesn't change, the fact is it's still kind of set in stone to a certain extent. But, basically, Jack's promising to kill her so that she doesn't end up, it's like, my mom, like, she tried to use the darkness to fight the darkness, but ended up being consumed by it, so she ended up having to kill her mom to stop her. So it's like she's hoping, like, the same thing. And it turns out, home dude, that's like her right-hand guy, like, there's a thing between them, and it's like, oh, that's interesting. I wasn't expecting that. So that was kind of, even Jack was like, I had no, it was like Roberto. It's like, oh, she's like, I didn't know there was a thing between. He's like, yeah, like, he's important to me, and, like, obviously he's a big part of, like, this fight. So so at the same time, like, Dalibor shows up because he tried to leave, but the Dark One, like, ended up biting everyone. And that's an interesting thing too. This is our first time seeing the Dark One actually changing, because at first she's like, oh, I'm going to eat you, because it's like, you know, I should be thanking you. She's like, I haven't eaten in forever. So once again, it's like, she's a vampire, she feeds and everything, but she's it makes sense. You're like the mother of all vampires, you're top dog, so of course your circumstances are a little bit different. But it's like, I was wondering, like, when she bit him, I was like, are they going to turn? And ultimately it seems like they do turn. So it's like, okay, so you do follow some, on some level, you do follow the same rules as kind of the vampires in this universe. But Dalibor, it's like, oh, like, I'll let your child live if you do something for me, and it's basically go get Jack. But Dalibor, working with Jack and them, ends up actually turning the tides against Michaela and actually using a spell against her. And so she gets trapped in an illusion because she thinks, like, oh, I've captured you, Jack, and everything, blah, 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 all your scheming. And it's like, nope. She gets, like, stabbed multiple times. Dalibor comes through, chops her head off. I was like, oh, she's dead in this continuity. I was like, oh, that's why I was like, oh, we're swinging for the fixes. Things are going to be completely different in this continuity. But that kind of immediately gets undone later on when it's like, oh, no, it's like, I brought back Michaela. Like, she got her head decapitated, but I knew you were going to do some shenanigans. So, like, I, like, restored her head and everything, so she's back. So it's like, okay, we're more in touch and in line with the original timeline. Obviously, it's kind of a thing of, hey, we don't have time to be saving people, so we're just cutting down every vampire in our way. Jack, you and Bathory go on ahead. We'll stop everyone. Dalibor ended up getting transformed. It's like, oh, if you're not going to serve me as a human, you'll serve me as, one of my, as a vampire. But what was interesting, though, is that when Jack, like, tried to, like, turn him back into human, she's like, what? You're not healing. Which also, it kind of made me go, like, all right, we're kind of defeating vampires easily. I was like, right. We're not dealing with daywalkers yet, so it's like, they're not as hard to kill back in the day. It's like, oh, do enough damage, they're dead. So I was like, right. So then, it's like, oh, man, back in simpler times when vampires are, yeah, they were kind of a bastard to kill modern day, but at least they were, like, at least easier to kill, because you have to go for the head with daywalkers. You don't have to do that with these versions of vampires, because you just have to do enough damage to, like, their heart and just their body and stuff like that, and they eventually just die. So, but I was wondering at first, I was like, why is that? I was like, that's so interesting. I was like, is she losing her power or something? Like, why is he still hurt and stuff like that? Because the situation is, like, everyone ends up ultimately recovering once they become bitten, because, like, even the wound on their neck ends up going away. It's like, doesn't mean, like, it's like it takes the Van Helsing situation plus a daywalker to create the, like, rapid healing process. But it's like, why he didn't heal, and I guess maybe we kind of find out the reason for that. Maybe because they're because of a bloodline thing. Because of that, Jack's abilities didn't fully heal him. It was maybe because, maybe it's circumstances of because he was bitten by the Dark One, it causes complications with the curing process. So it's like, yeah, he was reverted back to a human, but his wounds didn't heal because he became a vampire through the means of the Dark One and not just like other vampire means. I don't know. But together, Bathory. Well, for one, I think this should be an interesting. I think this kind of may be the key sign in some stuff. It's like Kristoff, the baby. She couldn't bring herself to eat the baby. I guess it's because regardless of what she said, there's still enough of Olivia in there that's like, I won't let you hurt my child. So she basically has the baby breastfeed from her. So it's like, right, you kind of get what you want to feed off his innocence, but now you're kind of pouring your darkness into that baby, which they're completely unaware of, which that in itself might ebb and flow into why some things are kind of what they are. This might kind of play into like, oh, this timeline being a little bit different. Maybe that's something where they're kind of implying like that's probably going to come up later on in the storyline. But yeah, Bathory and Jack working together to try and stop the Dark One, and Bathory's using his spell, and then partway through it, like the Dark One blinds her, and I was like, the moment the marks pop up on her face, I was like, oh, and that kind of right there immediately made me go like, okay, so we're obviously this is before Michaela popped back up, but I was like, oh, so this is kind of how that happened. I was like, so we're still getting some of that original timeline, and then I realized like, oh yeah, a lot of it ends up still being the same, but it's like, because I always noticed that, like, Bathory's eyes, like, when she was, like, with her voice like that, and, with her ash-covered face and everything, I always figured that was, like, noticed her eyes were different, but it never correlated in my head, like, she was blind. Had that come up before? I don't think they ever specifically said, like, outwardly said that she was blind. Maybe it was just always implied, but I never knew that. I was like, that's so fascinating. And I was like, and now we know how she ended up blind, too. But because that also explains, because obviously like how she is like with like the markings and everything, that means if she got bit she probably would return to like how she looks now, like when she's using her magic to look like herself. That's probably implying like she'd probably get her eyesight back, and healed potentially. But once again, maybe not, just because it was the Dark One that changed him, so maybe the circumstances are a little different. I thought it was so fascinating though that I mean, to be fair, they might be in extenuating circumstances where they might not be able to be changed back. I mean, they didn't bother with Michaela. They just straight up killed Michaela because it's like, nah, we're not going to let you live after everything you've done, which, complicated thing. It's like, some people lucked out like Ivory. Other people like Scab didn't luck out. People like Julius lucked out, So it's always just an interesting thing of who gets cured and who doesn't, It's not, I guess it's like, well, depending on whether or not we have the time to really dedicate to biting every single person, it's a war, so we just have to like kind of kill people, get to the Dark One so we can change things. But like I said, it was interesting knowing like, oh, so like Bathory's been blind the entire time, and I just never know, like I said, I don't think they ever expressly said that. Like I said, I guess it's just been implied, or maybe this is them kind of adding the continuity, like not retconning it, but being like, oh, like, yeah, Bathory's been blind this entire time. I was like, that's fascinating, because it was done before she was a vampire. Like, even though she got turned, it didn't recover it. But for her, it's like, oh, like, because I'm blind now, I see more than I ever could. Luckily, she remembers enough of the scroll that it's like, even if I'm blind, I can still do enough of the enchantment. So Jack is able to bite her, but by biting her, and I wonder, does this still apply present day? You still end up absorbing some of the darkness, and then it's like the necklace, you have to pour that darkness into it, so it kind of ties into why that necklace has always been important, why it kind of does the whole refilling blood thing. It's like, right, because a fraction of the Dark One's power has always been sealed away in that. Maybe the way they're talking about it makes it seem like that's not the case. So it seems like it was always a special vial, but even more, I guess, like its now we know its purpose was to always house some of the Dark One's power. Like, so if they had done it initially, they would have had to do this to put it somewhere. Because I think it's also coming full circle too, because Jack ended up being succumbed by the darkness by the Dark One present day, and so for her to be the one kind of having it stuck inside of her ripping away half of the Dark One's powers, and running, but for Michaela, for Bathory, it's like, my fate's kind of sealed, but you can still change everything. So they end up sealing away half of the Dark One's power. Dalibor, took Kristoff, gave it to Alexandra and Florian and told them to flee. For him, it's like, I made so many mistakes. He had talked about the fact is that his unwillingness to see Michaela and everything for what was right there in front of him caused all of this. It's like, my people are going to suffer, so he's trying to make things right at the end, and he burns the castle down, like, I guess using that as a sign for his, like, remaining people to get out of there, like, whatever vampires are trapped in there, maybe, like, are dealt with and no longer an issue. But yeah, Jack manages to escape with Roberto and the others. And so the moment, like, the whole thing of like, okay, so where are you going to go? It's like, I'm going to go to the New World. It's like, it's just like, it's my home. It's like, yeah, but it's not your home yet. It's like, well, that's tomorrow's problem. It's like, how the hell are you getting back home? That's the big question. At the very least, Vanessa, once again, time travel rules were a little different because she just time traveled her consciousnness. Plus, she had the power of an elder to yank her back. This currently seems like a one-way trip. We'll see how that plays out. Because it does. I was about to say, it's like, well, we don't. Van Helsing's are abnormalities, so we don't. It hasn't really come up whether or not they age or not. They're borderline like vampires to a certain extent because they can rapidly heal and everything. But it's like, do they age? This could be the option to be like, oh, set stuff in motion to be like, oh, Jack basically just had to wait the entire, like, centuries until we got to present day. Maybe, well, the fact is she doesn't change, like, more in history hasn't been altered, must mean that something happens where she finds her way back at some point towards America. But it's like, it's like, oh yeah, Roberto, I saw you drawing me, and she kind of realized, like, okay, like, it's connected to, like, what's in the Van Helsing book, so it's like, right, eventually the Roma will eventually pass it off to the first Van Helsing, so kind of gives her the book, and it's like, I'm leaving this for whoever is the first Van Helsing to kind of find this, so you take care of that baby, and it's like, they're like, she's like thanking them, but they're like, no, thank you for everything you've done. So obviously it's like they've changed time a little bit, but not a lot. So it's like, where things kind of go from here is kind of a big question. So at first I was like, all right, they're going to end up changing the baby's name. So I was like, what's the baby's name going to be? It's like, wait, is this baby going to be? And they say like, oh, let's name it. It's like, well, we're supposed to, we just said goodbye to our first Van Helsing, Jack. So it's like, why don't we actually start the Van Helsing line here with baby Kristoff being Jack Van Helsing? So that's why I was wondering, like, maybe because that means Jack is related to Dalibor. They're like, that's his descendant. So, which is also interesting too, because it's like, it kind of comes full circle, because it's like Olivia being the host for the Dark One. Like, they had talked about the fact that it's like Vanessa and Jack and Violet kind of come from her anyway. It's like, to an extent they kind of did, but that was beforehand. So I think that's also implying, like, they have a little bit of Olivia's light. The light that was inside of Olivia, what made her the perfect host for the Dark One, it lives on in Kristoff or Jack and gets passed down during a generation. So that light is there within them. They just have to find it, essentially. So that's kind of interesting to know that comes full circle in that regard. But then present day, like, the Dark One and Bathory sense, like, yeah, something's different. The past has been altered. And because, like, the Dark One's like, I've lost a fraction of my... So now, present day, the Dark One isn't nearly as powerful as she was before. Things have kind of been altered. Yeah, a lot of history ends up playing out and staying the same, but it also seems like, I wonder, like, how does that translate timeline-wise and stuff like that? Because it's like, right, so that means, like, the timeline shift over. It's like, I guess they still have their memories of the original timeline, because they don't, it's not correlating their head to, like, wait, Jack, we've already met her, because we don't know that. Once again, this time stuff, like, it's come up recently, with debris and everything, of, like, are we going to get into the nitty gritties of, like, what this means as the ripple effect of, like, yeah, things were changed a little bit, but there was so much that it's like, yeah, like, once again, this is kind of implying that maybe Jack always went back in time, or maybe it's like, we are on a new timeline, we are on a new path, because the Dark One doesn't have all of her powers. In the original timeline, she did. So it is kind of implying that, no, Jack going back in time didn't always happen, that this is the first time it's happened. So now we're on timeline B instead of the original timeline A. But like I said, the ripple effect of what else ends up being different, because Jack's out and about back then, knowing what they know now, Florian, Roberto. I'm also curious, like, what does that mean for, like, Alexandra? Because she was she's a cured human. You know, she can never be turned back into a vampire, but like, what does that mean generation-wise? Like, has that ever come up, whether or not that's passable on? Like, the vampirism is like a whole DNA thing in this. So, you know, the cure being in your blood, like, is that something that wanes generation over generation? Or, like, are her children immune? Or is it just enough to be like... Because, well, to be fair, like, when humans get cured, their blood can't cure. It's enough to cure them, and it taints their blood. So I kind of answered my own question. Never mind. It doesn't pass on to the next person. It gets stuck with. It dies. Like, when the moment it reverts that person, it taints their blood forever. But it can't be passed on, because if that were the case, anytime anyone that got cured got bitten, then other people would get cured as well. So it doesn't work like that. So it doesn't pass the blood on. Like I said, answer my question. So even if Alexandra or Floria ends up having kids of their own, that won't pass on. Like I said, kind of answered my own question. So, like I said, the ripple effects of this, what this means in the grand scheme of things. Once again, like, Jack left her message and what that meant for future generations, for her past generations of Van Helsings, as well as what that means for her own story, her and Vanessa and Violet. A lot of questions on that front. But the fact is, we are back present day. Guess that's where we're kind of hitting off now. But once again, still, maybe we'll flip back and forth every once in a while to find out, like, how Jack got back to, you know, be where she is, you know. Because you also can't forget, like, the Dark One is in Jack's body right now. She's just, like, using her magic powers to look like herself. So that's also a trippy paradox thing to a certain extent. Because it's like, well, that means Jack has a real body and everything. But I guess it's like, well, it was probably like the Dark One just disguised herself as Jack leaving, whereas the real Jack's body and everything got left behind. So I guess maybe that's what is ultimately implying. Like, that was never Jack's body. It was just the Dark One disguised as Jack. I guess that's kind of what that's always kind of been implying. Maybe. I don't know. Like, I just, my assumption had always been like, oh, she'd possess Jack's body, but it's like, no, the fact is, once again, I'm overthinking stuff, but it's just like, just gets you thinking, you know? So, once again, all these questions I have, will I actually get answers to? Probably not. Maybe the answers are already there. Once again, I'm just missing the context of it just because I'm an idiot. But, this sets up a lot of interesting stuff for the rest of this season of, like, you know, like I said, what else changed? Was it just a small thing of the Dark One only having a fraction of her power? Like, you know, because even Jack said, like, yeah, I changed history a small bit. Like, is that the only bit that changed? Or, like I said, what else are the ripple effects? Because the smallest changes can cause waves across the timeline. We'll ultimately have to wait and see, but I'm very interested to see where things take us, especially, which I believe we are, going back present day, so, like, you know, what that all entails is going to be interesting to see. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.